Welcome back to Fossil vs. Future. I'm Daisy.
And I'm James.
And today we're going to talk about...
what just happened?
For every episode of Fossil vs. Future, we choose a climate-related topic to chat about. One we think is important, interesting, and relevant. But these are big topics to cover in just 40 minutes. And usually the moment we hit stop on the recording, we think of more things we wish we'd said. Also, these topics don't stand still. Often something happens days after a recording that would have been key to mention. So, this episode is for those missing pieces. Today, we're looking back at our series topics, catching up on moments we missed, and considering what's happened in 2026 so far. So, Fossil versus Future, where do we stand?
So, Daisy, we thought it would be good to do this for pretty obvious reasons. I mean, we've had events in the last few weeks that have fundamentally altered how the world works and are emblematic of massive change that's happening in our society, in our conflicts between societies. Everything seems to be accelerating and compounding. There's lots of uncertainty. It's quite hard to keep level when trying to figure out how to solve highly complex problems like climate change. Everyone's looking for signs and clues and patterns, and we should do that. We should also pay attention to how these patterns are emerging and try and avoid hallucinations, because pattern recognition is important. Are we seeing a trend? Is this happening that I would like to see happening? That's always a trap for certainly folk like me who frequently blur what is and what ought to be, often for tactical reasons, as a form of advocacy, because I want that to happen. I argue for it happening. But don't delude yourself. Don't see a sign that isn't there. So I thought we ought to, in our conversations, keep up, adjust if necessary, be sure we're learning, be sure that some momentum is maintained in the key arguments that we feel we can advocate for, and persevere in the face of all this turbulence and uncertainty, because the what about question that we usually begin with now features this sort of, well, what about what just happened? What's your response to that? And it's challenging, right? It's challenging. And we've got a few topics that we wouldn't mind going back over, sometimes very positively, because something, as you say, we could have mentioned and forgot or didn't get round to might embellish the conversation that we had. And sometimes we just got to get to grips with the blocking of the Straits of Hormuz, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably the first one we should mention, James, is that in early February, we released our What About the Middle East and North Africa region episode, and literally weeks later, on the 28th of Feb, the United States and Israel attacked Iran, and that has had huge consequences. Well, firstly, we should say that it's having huge catastrophic impacts on people and families, but for the purposes of our podcast, Fossil versus Future, we'll speak about it from an energy transition lens. And the IEA's executive director has said the combined impacts amount to the greatest threat to global energy security in history. And as you said, I think probably one of the most prominent things has been the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, which is the transport route for around 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade. So blocking that shows the consequences of having an energy system that relies on these transport routes, which, is having huge consequences across the world.
And it's a very physical thing. We're used, and your generation certainly is used to accommodating a digital reality where bits and information have real currency, and virtual existence matters maybe more than my generation. And here's something really old-fashioned and physical. It's a gap. It's a gap in the world between land masses that vessels carrying materials have to go through, and they've been blocked. in a way which would have been familiar to any military force over the past 1,000 years. It's quite a remarkable jolt and a realization that geography matters, that an imbalance in military might can be rebalanced if you have command of that physical setting. And as you say, the blocking of the physical space has also blocked the flow of resources upon which we depend, and depend in a rather alarming way. We probably always knew that, but when something like this strikes, those dependencies become very real and very quickly. And we haven't really got to the end of it, have we? Things could just as easily become, I mean, that the supply shock that Fatih Birol was talking about from the IEA was substantial when he made that remark. But in a month's time, if it's not opened up, it will be catastrophic. Certainly some jurisdictions that are very dependent on fossil fuels, liquid fossil fuels, especially for transportation. And there are many other commodities too that we are now realizing we have dependencies for, whether it's urea or
fertilizer,
or helium or fertilizer, exactly, all these things too, which will have really, really severe consequences for people around the world who have nothing to do with the conflict directly. And so I was curious to know, okay, so how people are responding. Some places I know, partly because through friends and relationships and connections in conversation, have told me that the shortages of the rationing of fuels, for example, countries that perhaps have a high dependency on imported diesel, for example, even Australia would be an example. But Philippines, Sri Lanka, most actually of the Asian economies have very high dependencies on that fuel.
80% of the oil going through that route was destined for Asia.
Yeah, is it that high? Mm-hmm. So what are they doing about it? How could they respond? And what can you do quickly? Because these are big systems. It's quite hard to adjust. And many countries simply can't throw money in compensation to their populations. I mean, they could, but there are big consequences from that, as we know from how we compensated our own people during previous shocks, and certainly through COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war. And one of the ways people do respond, of course, is to dial up their renewables if they can, and purchase electric vehicles if they can. And that was interesting to track. And that is happening all around the world, maybe everywhere except the US, which is an outlier, certainly on EV purchases, probably more to do with changing some of the incentives that were there for EVs. The Trump administration took many of them away, and that has had an effect on sales. But everywhere else, the take-up of EVs has been remarkable and is accelerating. And the numbers are pretty spectacular. I mean, we've talked before about China. That was quite familiar. And there's a buffer for them in this situation to have sort of roughly 50% of new vehicles being EVs in China. But Vietnam, 40%, Thailand, 20%, Singapore, over 40%, Indonesia, a huge economy, already at 15% and growing. The EU, first quarter 26 sales up massively, so that whilst other sales are going down too, that's interesting that at the same time EV sales going up and petrol and diesel going down about 8 to 10%. EVs now up around 30% across Europe. But I also think about countries that have very little, are really vulnerable. Sri Lanka, for example, rationing petrol and diesel, dramatic increase in EV purchases. Ethiopia has actually banned ICE engines, quite incredible, and makes us really pay attention to this argument about the cost of electric vehicles. And we have a ludicrous meme here. Maybe it's understandable where it started, but not where it is now. There's still a political argument that EVs are for rich people. And all of this post-Hormuz, where electric vehicles are now an energy security product of choice, even if you knew nothing or cared nothing about climate, from
Yeah.
an energy security point of view, you'd choose EVs. And those are countries, you can't argue that the choices in Ethiopia or Sri Lanka or
Well,
or Bangladesh are rich people choices. They're not. And India, China, Mexico, they're all producing under $10,000 vehicles that are electric. So I think that's a big consequence of the war.
Yeah, those are incredible numbers. I think Christiana Figueres on Outrage and Optimism spoke about this in a way I thought was really clear, that this conflict shows that there are two big problems with our reliance on fossil fuels. One, that only a handful of countries supply fossil fuels, and we're reliant on those countries for these fuels. And then secondly, the fact that these fuels require transport, and how dangerous it's becoming to depend on a handful of countries and this physical means of transport that you're describing, James. And I've seen articles saying, sunlight doesn't need to travel through the Strait of Hormuz, and it's
light
true.
is abundant. If there's anything that's abundant, it's light.
Exactly. We need to move away from these imported, transported fossil fuels. And it's really sad that something like this may end up being the wake-up call that the world needs to recognise this alternative, better way of sourcing energy. But the numbers you're describing shows that there is...
They're also they're not going to stop. So these percentage increases in the first quarter, they'll carry on.
Yeah.
And I don't think I know enough about what the thresholds are for the change in the whole system. But China must be showing when that happens. By which I mean, how many purchases of electric vehicles of all types, and bearing in mind now they're heavy trucks, which we didn't think necessarily were going to be where we didn't think that batteries would beat molecules, as it were, but they seem to be, certainly in China, as battery prices come down, and basically they just get better. But at what stage does the transportation system, reorient around electric vehicles as opposed to combustion engines that burn fossil fuels? It must be approaching quite rapidly. I would say within 5 to 10 years in China. That's a really significant thing.
Yeah.
But we know that you've still got to move materials around the world. There's a physical needs of moving panels and
exactly,
minerals
including
that go
the materials
into them.
you need for the renewables.
That still has to happen. So it's not like there are no supply chain problems with solar PV and the attendant technologies. Of course there are, but it's a different problem. And
upfront.
It's true that there are still dependencies there that you'd want to watch for. At the moment, China is so far ahead of the rest of the world in the production of all of these technologies. And that's fine when you have open, liberalized trade and peace. It's not so fine if you don't.
Yeah.
So it still is a security issue. If you're going to trumpet, as I think we are, the value of these technologies from a security point of view, then you've got to deal with these other securities at the same time. You've got to make sure that your power system is secure from cyber attack. You've got to make sure your supply chains doesn't have other dependencies on, for example, the raw materials, the rare earths, and the manufacturing competence that China has that is far superior to other parts of the world now. You can see India racing hard to catch up, or Mexico, Korea, Brazil, these places that produce vehicles, seeing the signs, following the patterns and saying, okay, I think now we're going to move. The next people's vehicle, VW, to use its generalist term, will be electric. And we will make it in Brazil, Mexico, Korea, or hopefully one day in other parts of the world that haven't got industries today but could, because the manufacturing process is different from a combustion engine. And as long as you can make the batteries, then you can pretty much assemble a plant that looks very like another plant somewhere else.
And for those that are interested in this electrification transition, you were telling me yesterday, James, about Michael Liebreich's Electrification Staircase. Which
gone from the hydrogen ladder to the electrification staircase.
And it shows how there are some things that you can and we can electrify right now, and they make sense financially. You can save money with these electrification solutions, but there will be other things where the technology exists, but it's not quite ready for that huge rollout yet. And Michael has this staircase of how we're going to move upwards from
it's
EVs
a useful
where we are
thing
now. And
it's good for resetting conversations about what's possible and also where to channel effort. We did go over this ground before. It's a tough one, and requires good quality leadership in business and politics to be able to aim accurately at such a complex interaction between already complex problems. So where do you spend effort? And this electrification staircase is useful for showing you, okay, well, if you were to expand, that step we're on, right? If we make that more stable, solid, then you can take the next one. I find it useful. Obviously, there will be debate around, and different points of view, of course, what's ready, what's not ready, at what cost, and where. The technologies are in some way universal, because light is, or electrification isn't something that is exclusive to anywhere in the world, but the capacity to move towards it, yes, that varies and needs to be financed, and finance doesn't cost the same everywhere. So I do feel like that story of electrification has become more compelling following the war, and the split between those who are pushing it and those who are resisting it more obvious, ironically, given the US's technological superiority in many other fields, including AI, which no doubt we're going to come back to too.
We should.
The politics of the moment have dampened down the potential for the US to be leaders in the electrification world. But this doesn't mean to say it's not happening. It's just happening perhaps more quietly and out of view of, or despite, the current administration in the States. And of course, pretty much every day after our various attempts to deal with the AI story, there's a new AI story, and it's all connected to
well,
energy.
Maybe that should be our next topic to speak about, James, is, like you say, out of all the topics that we have discussed, I think AI and data centers is probably the one that is moving the fastest. Something that's I found really interesting in the last couple of months is that while the build out of data centers and conversations around data centers are surging, so are the protests against them. And there's some really interesting articles coming out about the local criticism that data centers are facing due to, like you say, the huge amounts of water they consume, which is a particular concern for communities living in water-scarce regions. Also, the huge amounts of energy that these data centers are using during this moment where energy supply is tight in some areas. And also when prices are rising as well in the US, electricity prices have been rising and communities are concerned that this is due to data centers. There are also concerns around the noise, the lack of transparency over who is actually going to be using this data center, air quality. And there's a resource called Data Center Watch, who actually track the public opposition to data center development in the US. And as we spoke about in our data center episode, this series, the hyperscalers are they're forecasting, I think, $710 billion of data centers in North America this year. And to some extent, the high valuation of these companies is dependent on their ability to deliver on these huge promises. But last year, in 2025, Data Center Watch report that at least $156 billion of data center projects, so 48 projects, were blocked or stalled due to local opposition. And so it's interesting to see that communities opposing these projects is really beginning to have an impact, and it's actually going to maybe feed through to legislation as well. And I think at the federal level, there's some nervousness around this as well. And apparently, Washington has threatened to withhold federal funding to states deemed to be putting up too many obstacles. So that's a topic that I would have liked to have spoken about when we had our data center episode.
Yes,
that I've become
there were some
more
examples of this sort of resistance that came up after our episode. And so ideally, if you went back and did it again, you'd say energy, yes, water, yes, but also license to operate communities. We did mention it in our podcast.
We did,
but we've now seen more evidence that this is a serious issue for the hyperscalers and their investors. And obviously, they're in a race, and they can get slowed down by public opposition. So that's going to be a factor in the business and economics and financial returns of the massive, staggering investments that are being made in the physical infrastructure for AI. And there are signs there of a resistance that has social and political consequences that might cause real harm to the hyperscalers' ambitions. People can see some underlying unfairness, and it reveals an inequality of power, bargaining power. The money behind these investments gets what it wants, and our communities don't. And there's this potency in that resistance. And the US perhaps is the trialing ground for that kind of opposition. And I mean, it's one to watch, isn't it? It's really one to watch. It'll make a big difference. So much money has been invested in these companies, and it's having consequences. I mean, the bet on AI, the feeling that it is going to be absolutely transformational to our economies, is having two quite extraordinary effects, to my eye anyway. One is that the stock markets just keep barreling on. They still seem to go up and up and up, despite all these very obvious risks that we're talking about. It's as if the market just said, well, yeah, we can see that, but AI, but there's this kind of major conviction that there is going to be a total transformation, and they've got to stay in that investment race. And they may be right, they may be wrong, but my feeling is that there's more risk because of that. The failure to really pay attention to what's at risk because of the war and other conflicts will at some stage come and hurt that conviction. So that's all happening. The markets just keep going up. But also I noticed over the weekend that Chris Hone, CIF, Children's Investment Fund fame, a very, very, very successful, long-time, consistent investor, has reduced his holding in Microsoft because he thinks that Microsoft will be threatened by the rise in artificial intelligence, especially in the coding and software area. So even within the very strong growth in value in stock markets, there's instability just because of, even within the positive space, there's instability because we don't know where this is all going to end up. It adds to all the uncertainty that surrounds all of these conversations. And yet you could argue, and maybe we should try and argue, that if there's a license to operate problem for these hyperscalers, they need to spend time and effort figuring out how they can solve that. Mm-hmm. What could they do to get the license that they want to grow their business? Now, could that be in having more renewable energy, having more cooperative ways of managing water? Could it be investments in nature and conservation? After all, communities might want some of the money to be put into natural systems that might store and conserve water that could be used for, say, agricultural production or some other value that they care about in their communities. Maybe that's a way of managing the opposition by finding ways in which they could be satisfied with some different type of investment or collaborative venture. That could happen. I could see that happening actually engagement in the States.
Yeah. Managing how they work with, collaborate with, give benefits to communities. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. I think another topic that we wanted to return to was just 2 weeks after we discussed what Turkey might prioritise in their action agenda at COP31, the first letter from the president was released. The letter began by framing COP31 as the COP of the future, building on what we have learned from the past and applying this to the present. They mentioned that it will be an implementation-focused approach that is inclusive and balanced. And the presidency will be guided by 3 core principles: dialogue, consensus, and action. The letter confirms that the pre-COP meeting will be held in Fiji in October, including a leaders' event in Tuvalu. And the COP31 Action Agenda will focus on the following key areas. I think several of these we did discuss during our episode, but the first is strengthening the zero waste and circular economy approach. I think we discussed that this was expected to be at the top of the list, as this is a key focus of Turkey's
There's
First
always
Lady.
an individual or a relationship that matters.
Yeah. And despite the current context, accelerating the clean energy transition was number 2 on their list of key areas. Then supporting green and low carbon industrialization, increasing the resilience of vulnerable regions, oceans and seas, supporting food security and developing sustainable agricultural systems, promoting climate resilient and sustainable cities, strengthening financial and institutional mechanisms that support climate action, increasing the active participation of youth, and promoting a cross-sectoral action to jointly address climate change, biodiversity loss, and land degradation. And I think, related to the second to last point there, the letter also announced the appointment of their youth climate champion for this year, which will be Sally Higgins. She's a cattle farmer from Queensland in Australia and is passionate about community transition planning, natural resource policy, and climate resilience. I think one comment to say about this would be, I think there was some expectation that this year's youth climate champion would be from the Pacific region, as Australia's role with Turkey at COP31 is partly to promote the Pacific Islands in this conversation. So I think some think it's maybe a bit of a shame that a Pacific national wasn't given this role, but Sally seems,
seems great. But you're right, there's been some very good young Pacific leaders who have been, let's face it, effective already, not least in the area of litigation. So that's interesting, isn't it? And it's such a good example of how the COP process works, that list, which is a great list, but it's just a list.
Yeah, so, not much new on there, really.
No, it just gets back around to what we have been talking about, but need to keep on, which is, all right, so climate change is all about everything. Yeah, okay, we got that. And it involves loads and loads of trade-offs and lots of different constituencies, and it's very hard. Yeah, we understand that too. But this list, if you're going to do something about it, you've got to form powerful groupings of interest who are seriously committed to implementing it in whatever way they can, and whatever they can is going to vary. So you've got to break bits off, and good climate champion leadership can do that. It can't do it in all that long. It's a long list. It's a lot to do, but if they can pick one or two things and really push on and show progress. And offer that as an example to others, and then hallelujah. And I think it's an interesting combination of countries. It can be very hard to do the diplomacy at this time.
Yeah.
But I hope they'll give it a really good, I hope they won't be dissuaded from the massive effort required to pull off a successful COP process by the times we are in. And I hope they'll be encouraged that the very conflicts that we are experiencing right now, so there's an antidote, if there is one, is to emphasize how one cooperates despite the conflict. I mean, we happen to be in a phase, I don't want to overstate this, but where diplomacy is almost redundant, right? With these big power blocks and with a lot of the work, if that's the right word, being done between powerful blocks to try and resolve these conflicts, is not being done by professional diplomats. Certainly in the US, they're all family members, close associates. They're the same people doing all the negotiations. It's very transactional. It's as if everything in the world is a property deal. So if you're a professional diplomat, it's just not your world at all. And you can understand why there is a reaction against diplomacy in its traditional form. Oh, it's so slow. Oh, it's full of this formality we don't like. Let's just get straight to the deal. Diplomacy's been around for a very, very long time, and it's sometimes best to keep working through those processes rather than pretend you can solve things in the cycle of a social media post. So I think for anyone leading diplomatic negotiations now, particularly one this difficult, it's hard. Right? But I hope that those who are doing the work here, especially the Australian delegation, will persevere anyway, do the very best they can, don't get distracted, don't get deflated by the daily insults, and just focus on a few things that could be done effectively by those who are willing to put that effort in, maybe because of or despite the confrontation they're getting pretty much daily from those who don't care at all about diplomatic processes. That's what I hope they will do. And maybe the other thing that happened, of course, post our discussion, was the meeting in Colombia of the.
That's exactly what I was just going to mention, James. Yeah, I think that's a positive example.
Just riff on that a bit.
Yeah. We mentioned the first transitioning away from fossil fuels conference in our second conversation with Jack and Heidi, and that took place at the end of April in Santa Marta, Colombia, co-hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands. And overall, I think it was a success. It brought together a coalition of the willing, so 57 countries representing 1/3 of the world's economy, came together outside of the formal UN process to discuss concrete ways to shift away from coal, oil, and gas. It wasn't a space for negotiation, but it was a forum for countries to discuss practical steps to transition away from fossil fuels. And in general, it sounds like the feedback from this new format was that it was refreshing, successful, groundbreaking, and all the meetings took place under Chatham House rules, but there was a key takeaway document that was released. I thought it was interesting that during the opening press conference, the hosts announced that they did decide to only invite a select group of countries to the conference. Countries including China, Russia, and the US were not invited to be there. And Carbon Brief understands that India was also not invited. So interesting that a decision was made to not invite those countries that perhaps have been less productive in past, I don't know, less collaborative in previous conversations. And there were some high impact outcomes from the event. So France used the event to release a landmark roadmap to phase out fossil fuels, setting clear exit dates: coal by 2027, oil by 2045, and gas by 2050. And Colombia actually also set out a draft roadmap for their own energy transition. A scientific panel for the global energy transition was established to help policymakers with enabling clean energy transitions in their countries. And the work streams were also launched related to debt resolution, as this was discussed as a big hurdle for many developing countries when it comes to the energy transition. A synthesis of a report will be published in the coming months, hopefully ahead of COP31. And it was also announced that the process will continue with a second conference hosted by Ireland and Tuvalu in 2027. So I think productive conversations that felt like things were moving forward.
Yeah. And again, if just a few of that group, it's quite a big group, really, but a few of them who have significant energy demand, or in the case of Colombia and others are exporters too, if they develop domestic policies that reshape the markets for fossil fuel products, that has a material effect. You take down demand, well, I mean, you create space for something else, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting that they came together, that they were able to work stuff out, that they took out of the picture those that they thought would dominate or obstruct. That's okay. And they made some progress. Good. I'm all for that attempt to use what political power you've got to reshape the space for investment, technology innovation, use what political economy levers you've got to incentivize a transition at a faster rate. And now you have this extra reason for doing it. Well, it was always there, but it's just more obvious now that there's security and energy security value associated with that transition. And many of these countries will know it and feel it in real time following this particular or the latest example of a conflict over resource. But one of the other areas where I wanted us to go back around, partly because I wish I'd said something at the time, and then by pure coincidence, I chair the board of a foundation focused on the sustainable urban environment, the Holcim Foundation. Holcim's a big building materials business. And I went to their innovation center in Lyon and learned all about how biochar, which we talked about, but we talked about largely in the context of agriculture, and how you could take agricultural waste and use pyrolysis, and when it's added to soil, it produces a very interesting effect of storing carbon in the soil, and it's both ancient and modern, and we talked about it. But what I forgot to say, or didn't know enough about, was to say that can also be done in building materials, and that so concrete and cement with biochar, same process, but fixed in building materials, is possible and is being piloted. And there's just one great example. It's a pilot, but I'm fascinated by how it's going. In Canary Wharf, here in London, the Canary Wharf group have done this pilot project with Holcim using biochar from coppiced wood and coffee grounds. There's something I just love about this. Yeah. All the coffee drunk in Canary Wharf, nervously anticipating market change. The waste coffee has gone into biochar and into building materials, which they are using.
Very cool.
Of course, you've got to meet the right performance standards. You can't experiment with building materials that can't meet the specifications. And of course, then in a highly competitive marketplace, you've got to be able to compete on cost. But the sense is that for projects where the person doing the specifying actually cares about the life cycle of the materials and the CO2 footprint of the buildings, that these products, including biochar and concrete, can compete on cost. And so I do, given there's so much that can be done in the built environment, and it's on the agenda, as you said, to have some innovation like that, dealing with material that's quite difficult to substitute in many circumstances. Lord knows the amount of concrete and cement we use around the world, staggering. But if we have got technological solutions that add to our range of solutions and can store carbon in those materials, that's a very good thing. And we didn't talk about it specifically in the episode, and we could put some details for people to follow up afterwards.
It's a really nice example of using waste in a productive way. Yeah, I love it. I think it shows that while there are lots of sad, depressing things happening in the world, in the sustainability sphere as well, it's a tough time for sustainability professionals. There are these examples out there, and in a way it's exciting that you can no longer use the argument it's doing the right thing or it's doing good, or at least not in the current climate, but there are more and more ways that it makes financial sense. I hate to use the term, but the business case for sustainability in some ways is stronger than ever.
I know, it's a funny thing, isn't it, Daisy? You want to be able to make these arguments because they make sense in a scientific context, or they make sense because it's fair and just, or they make sense because it's the innovation itself is attractive and more beautiful or more something else. And then in the end, you keep going around about, it's economic, it makes financial sense. I find it tiring and sort of debilitating in spirit. But I have had to learn I've had to learn that language and be confident in it in order to increase the chances of success. Mm-hmm. And I also think in conversations with people in my circles anyway, there is a feeling right now that it's a good time to invest in these technologies and in these ideas and the manifestation of these ideas, whilst they are under attack and are undervalued politically, especially in the States. I think you could draw up a list of investments in the States that are currently under siege from this administration and systematically work through them and then hang on, and do well.
Yeah, commit to the long term.
So maybe that's another strange version of buying the dip, that you just persevere and stay true to your intentions.
Yeah. Fossil versus future.
Fossil versus future.
Thank you so much for listening to Fossil versus Future. Please subscribe to our podcast and give us a rating. And please follow us on social media. Let us know the what about questions that you want us to discuss.